Okay, hi everyone, I'm Stefanie Williamson. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about my research and my preliminary findings. I've got a lot to say, so apologies that it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind whistle-stop tour of what I've been doing. So, the research I've been doing has focused on precarious employment amongst young people and the development of their employment over time. So when I'm talking about precarious work, I'm kind of using it as a bit of a catch-all term. So specifically, I've been looking at trends in unemployment, part-time, temporary and routine employment. And I mean, these things in themselves are very problematic, and if you want to ask me about it afterwards, you can. We have this sense also that inequalities occur, and we've heard a bit about that today already. So a big part of my focus has been to explore how patterns of inequality may have changed in the recession. In the recession, obviously, youth unemployment increased, but also rates of part-time work and temporary work increased. As well as this, I've been keen to explore issues of socio-economic status attainment, particularly because the intersection of low-status work with part-time and temporary jobs and unemployment, as well as because of longer-term trends in the hollowing out of the labour market. So the research I've been doing is a secondary quants analysis. I've been contrasting two cohorts of young people. So my pre-recession cohort are aged between 16 and 24 in 2003, and I follow them to 2007. And then my recession cohort were aged between 16 and 24 in 2009, and I follow them to 2013. The methods I've been using, as I said, they're quantitative. I'm using sequence analysis, which is great because it allows you to build a whole picture of development across time, taking into account lots of changes in status. What I'm going to talk to you about today, though, is specifically wave-to-wave transitions, so the movement in and out of these precarious forms. So I'll start off by giving a bit of an overall picture about some changes in the recession, and then I'll go on to talk about the issues of inequality that I've found so far. I think I might be giving a bit more of an optimistic picture than you might expect today. We'll see. So unemployment in both cohorts was typically only for one wave. The recession cohort, as we might expect, experienced more consecutive waves of unemployment. So, for example, 12% of the sample experienced 2 consecutive waves of unemployment, and this was compared to only 5% of the pre-recession cohort. A key difference I found with unemployment was, in the recession, it seemed to become kind of a normalised element of moving from education to employment. So, for example, half of the sample moved into unemployment from a previous position of education in the previous wave, and this was compared to only 31% for the pre-recession cohort. Despite higher levels of unemployment in the recession, in terms of moving on from unemployment, the signs were actually fairly good, with 67% of those who left unemployment being employed in the following wave. Participation in part-time work was more prolonged amongst the recession cohort. There was a sense that part-time work became kind of more of an employment trap. So there was more incidence of consecutive waves of part-time working, but also the relationship of part-time work with other statuses changed a little bit. So more people moved from part-time work in one wave to unemployment in the following wave. This was 14% of those leaving part-time work entered unemployment in the following wave, compared to only 8% in the pre-recession cohort. Despite this, however, it was still the most typical thing for people to move out of part-time work and into full-time work. Temporary employment was quite transitory, as we might expect, being temporary work. Young people leaving temporary work, by far, about 80% moved into permanent work in the following wave. So that's quite a good sign. Young people who participated in temporary work in the recession cohort were actually a little better off. There were higher levels of movement into permanent work and also lower levels of movement into unemployment. What I saw with routine work was that it became less secure in the recession, so more people who had routine work in one wave were unemployed in the following wave. I also saw that upward mobility decreased for this group, so there was less movement to intermediate or management work. In particular, there were quite large declines in the movement of people from routine to intermediate work. And this really signalled to me this issue of the hollowing out of the labour market. Rates of intermediate work were just so much lower amongst the recession cohort of young people. So I get the sense that these jobs were going away, and I think that disadvantaged young people in being able to move out of this routine work. Overall then, I would say that there was some evidence of precarity. However, it was typical for people who experienced these precarious forms to move into the non-precarious form in the subsequent wave. However, of course, this is for the full sample, and as worker people like Rob McDonald suggests, there may be advantages and disadvantages incurred by some people. So I've looked a bit at inequality. Specifically so far, I've looked at gender and class background as measured by parent socioeconomic status. So I'll talk to you a bit about gender first. There were some gender differences in movement out of unemployment. Men had more consecutive waves of unemployment, and they also experienced larger increases in the frequency of consecutive waves of unemployment than women did in the recession. Despite this, men were more likely than women to be employed in the following wave, whereas for women, unemployment was more associated with inactivity. The percentage of men finding themselves employed after a period of unemployment increased in the recession to 81%, whilst for women in the recession, this percentage moving into employment declined further. I found that there were particular gendered ways in which part-time work was embedded in trajectories. It signalled to me that part-time work was much more indicative of labour market difficulty for men than women in the recession cohort. So amongst the pre-recession cohort, part-time work for men was more associated with education. They were more likely to move in and out of part-time work from a status of education participation. For women, again, part-time work was more associated with inactivity, which might be what we would expect given gender and caregiving. Amongst the recession cohort, the pattern changed. So for men, whereas previously they had had this association of part-time work with education, this declined and was offset by the movement of men to and from part-time work into unemployment. The movement for men from part-time work to full-time work also declined amongst the recession cohort. For women in the recession, movement in and out of part-time work didn't change so much. So I would say that there was a bit of a narrowing of the gap between genders, and this was typically to the detriment of men. There was less gender differentiation for temporary employees. Men had been disadvantaged compared to women in the pre-recession cohort, so they were more likely to be unemployed in the following wave after temporary work than women. However, amongst the recession cohort, again, I saw kind of a narrowing of the gap between genders, and this time it was because men were better off than they had been. So temporary work became a better bridge to permanent work for men, and they also saw less movement into unemployment. Again, the recession cohort of women weren't so different from the pre-recession cohort of women. Where I did find some change for women was in terms of upward mobility from routine work. So women in the recession were affected more detrimentally than men compared to their pre-recession counterparts. Although men were more likely to have consecutive waves of routine work, in both cohorts, in the recession, the percentage of women experiencing these consecutive waves of routine work increased. So for example, there was a 17 percentage point increase in women having 2 waves of routine work compared to pre-recession women. Women also saw large declines in the wave-to-wave movement from routine to intermediate work. This transition also declined for men, but intermediate work was not so typical amongst men in the pre-recession cohort anyway. So it seems that where I saw these declines in intermediate work overall, this was affecting women more so than it was men. Women also saw larger declines than men in the movement from routine to managerial work. Again, I would say that the gap between men and women got narrower in the recession, but this time it was at the expense of women. So in terms of gender overall, the pattern is pretty complex, and I've really given a very vague outline of things I've been finding. Well, I'm going to skip through, talk a little bit about class. There were some definite class trends going on. You can see that in the pre-recession cohort there was a clear pattern associated with movement out of unemployment, which saw those from managerial backgrounds more likely to be employed in the subsequent wave. In contrast, those from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds were more likely than others to move from unemployment into inactivity, suggesting a discouraged worker effect. We see that in the recession, unemployment, as we would expect, became more commonplace amongst all groups. However, how it manifested itself was different for the different classed groups. So, for example, those from a management background tended to deal with unemployment by moving back into education, whereas in contrast, those from non-working backgrounds saw increases in the movement from unemployment to inactivity and no increase in the movement to education. The recession kind of made the classes a little more similar in terms of these movements, but there were some definite advantages and disadvantages that we could see. Part-time work was less secure for those from a non-working background, with this group having the highest movement into unemployment in the wave after part-time work. There were some unexpected changes in the recession, however. There were declines in the movement to unemployment for those from non-working and from managerial backgrounds, and there were increases in the movement to unemployment for those from routine and intermediate backgrounds. Although both the managerial and non-working background respondents saw these declines in the movement to unemployment, they were offset by very different things. So again, respondents from a management background tended to move back into education, whereas those from non-working backgrounds tended to move into inactivity again. Despite these advantages and disadvantages in the recession, you can still see that the majority of people moved into full-time work in the wave after part-time work. There's a sense that temporary work brought more difficult experiences for those from a routine background than from the intermediate or management backgrounds. There's a suggestion that temporary work, possibly like part-time work, was more of a stopgap before education for those from more advantaged backgrounds. Inequalities between the classes actually got wider in the recession. So those from intermediate and management backgrounds saw increases in their movement from temporary work to permanent work, whilst there wasn't such an improvement for those from a routine background. Those from a routine background also saw the highest movement into unemployment in the pre-recession and saw the largest increases in this transition type in the recession. There were also class patterns in terms of socioeconomic status transitions. Routine work was more secure for those from the more advantaged class backgrounds, and there was a direct pattern where higher socioeconomic status background brought a lower movement from routine work to unemployment. In the recession, this pattern was replicated for the most part. However, those from a management background were the only group that actually saw a decline in movement from routine work to unemployment. There were also class differences in upward mobility. However, in the recession, this changed somewhat and kind of unexpectedly. Respondents from an intermediate background actually saw large increases in the movement from routine work to management work, whilst conversely those from routine and management backgrounds saw the largest declines in this type of movement. Overall then, I would say in general, higher socioeconomic background was typically associated with more labour market advantage. Management respondents seemed to be less affected by changes in the recession, and it was more typical where they experienced precarious forms of work for them to move back into education. Those from non-working backgrounds and routine backgrounds were typically less advantaged. However, again, like gender, there was no single pattern of advantage or disadvantage that I could see. So to conclude, the overall pattern suggests that precarious employment is not a long-term thing, and typically young people find themselves better off in the wave after precarious work. But this does obscure underlying class and gender inequalities, and I suppose what I really want to highlight is that although we're not all precarious now, the patterns of inequality are changing and complex, and there's not this one clear pattern which suggests that one group is always disadvantaged relative to others.